have Scott?
I think we're going.
Okay. Okay.
Let's pray.
Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. Tonight we're going to finish up with Rico and Fortuny. And since we're at the Meadows Museum, I mean, we will be talking about French Impressionism, of course, because I wouldn't let y'all go without showing you some Monet. But we're also going to look at some of the Spanish artists and look at the effect of Spanish artists on American artists, American collectors on a lot of artists, etc. It was pointed out to me last week that the first week we were in the forest, last week we were on riverbanks, and this week we will be at the beach, which as our car temperatures hit 100 degrees today, that's a good place to be, even if it's just mentally. Before we talk about French politics, because you know, the politics of the time were so important, we need to look at another region of the world that was so important at this time, and of course that's Japan. Now, starting in the 1840s, France was starting to have a few diplomatic connections to Japan. Japan was largely a closed society. It had remained closed for 250 years, but the French were sort of massaging their ways in, which worked out well for them because in the 1850s and 60s, their silkworm production, or their silkworms were hit by terrible epidemics. And so their ability to make silk declined rapidly, and it wasn't until their industry picked up several years later they were able to get by. So they started to import silk from Japan, which was really fortuitous. For us in America, our then president, Millard Fillmore, which I will now be able to tell you one of Millard Fillmore's, I don't know if it's an accomplishment, but main things that he did while he was in office was to open up trade with Japan. And he commissioned, in 1853, he commissioned Commodore Matthew Perry to go to Japan and open up trade, whether the Japanese wanted it open or not. And he encouraged Perry to use what he called gunboat diplomacy, which, I don't know, just doesn't sound like a great international diplomatic tactic, but that's what happened. The US started trading with Japan, Europe was trading with Japan, and suddenly, really, this unknown world was open up to both American and European artists. So up here we've got this image of showing that the silk was Japanese. And like any good marketing person, oh, this isn't working. Any good marketing person, rather than saying, sorry, our silkworms all died, you can say, we've got silk, ours is from Japan. And so you've got this wonderful combination of the rising sun, chrysanthemum blossoms, etc. What starts getting wrapped up, or what starts wrapping up a lot of the export things that come from Japan are newspapers and papers that have Japanese woodblock printing on them. And suddenly, this whole new realm of inspiration comes to artists to Europe, and then eventually the United States. This is from Utagawa Hiroshige from Tale of the Genji, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name. The Tale of the Genji, you probably know, it's considered the first novel. It was written around 1000 of the Common Era, and it has been a source of inspiration for artists ever since. But what you see here are some of the hallmarks that become important in 19th century French and American painting. These layers, these various layers, this strange horizon line, tilted perspective that here in this one we're looking down on the imagery, but you still have all these various planes, a lot of flattened perspective. One of the ways in which the artists would separate the stories would be by these wonderful clouds, and you sort of get a sense of it here. The Crow collection has a magnificent screen with the Tale of the Genji, and so you see all these wonderful layers. They also had an exhibition up in the fall, it might still be up, of the Japanese perspective of foreigners arriving on their shores, which is quite interesting because we don't usually see it from that perspective. When we left last, the Franco-Prussian War was raging in Europe, beginning in 1870. In 1871, January of 1871, France surrenders, Napoleon III abdicates, he flees to England, Alsace and Lorraine become German territories, goes back to France after World War I. The Commune rules in France for a few months, and then in May of 1871, the Third Republic is formed. This was supposed to be provisional, and there was a call by some people to bring back a monarchy, but nobody could really agree on what type of monarch they should bring back. So the first president, a man named Adolphe Thiers, called the new power structure the form of government that divides France the least. And it managed to stay in place until 1940. So there was calm, there was stability. This was the era of colonization by European countries in Asia, for France and Indochina, obviously in Asia, what's now Vietnam, in Polynesia, in Africa, etc. So it was during this time that the world got carved up by these powers. Now, when we left off last time, we were talking about Fortuny and Rico, Martin Rico and Mariano Fortuny, and the fact that they were traveling together. So they had left France because of the Franco-Prussian War. They traveled to Granada together in Spain. It's here that Fortuny enhanced his collection of Arab antiquities. Rico became interested in, they call them Oriental exoticism, but it's really sort of from North Africa, the exoticism from North Africa. Islamic art and architecture starts appealing to him, and from his memoirs at the time, Martin Rico wrote, "I owe much of my progress in that period to him for having freed me from many academic concerns that had burdened me since I was at school." Fortuny, writing to Ricardo de Madrazo, says, "Rico's paintings look very good in the Goupil Gallery, and any one of them is like a diamond among unworthy fragments of glass." And I understand a lot of people beeline to our Rico after class last week, and I'm glad that you did. And if you didn't last week, please be sure to do so this week, because it's one of his beautiful paintings that he did in Venice. Now, they worked together, their styles informed one another, and Fortuny loved Italy. And as you know, his son has an atelier that's still in Venice. Mariano, the father, preferred Rome. He brought Rico to Rome with him. He invited him to come to Rome. And Rico arrived in Christmas of 1872, and he had this to say about it. "Many galleries with dark paintings, many museums that were once good, but that you now have to guess at. Many Englishmen and many Americans, and many art lovers." So Rico hated Rome, could not leave there fast enough. He went to Venice, which he much preferred. However, Fortuny managed to persuade him to come back the following April and to go to the beach with their wives, the beach at Naples, the beach of Porticini. And here you've got this wonderful nude. It is not a corpse, that is a living child, although from this perspective it's hard to tell, from 1874. This series of paintings that we're seeing now are all from 1874. It is significant that they went to the beach at Porticini around this time, because in France, in the spring of 1874, this group of radical artists who earned the derisive name of Impressionists because of their exhibition were showing. And so word of their exhibition, I'm sure, was traveling around Europe. And it was the first time that Fortuny started to really paint en plein air, to go outdoors and capture these essences of light and sun and water and movement. He did a lot of images of nude children at the time. You see the effects of Japanese painting, of woodblock paint prints, this really strange perspective. You're not quite sure if it's tilted up or it's tilted down. This magnificent use of light, and really a wonderful combination of a lot of things going on in the art world at the time. In this image on the right of the beach at Porticini, which has been in our collection here, you see this wonderful slice that also, it's believed, was inspired by Japanese woodblocks, scrolls, etc. And how he would have known about these is because in 1872, William Hood Stewart, about whom we will talk in a moment, gave Martin Rico Japanese scrolls and a number of Japanese objects. And so this format, this long, thin painting with just these wonderful bands of color, would have been something that Fortuny would have known. You also have this combination, we talked a lot with landscapes, of 1/3 landscape, 2/3 sky that you see here. So again, he's really synthesized everything that was happening in Europe. Now this is our new acquisition, the beach at Porticini, also from the same time, from 1874. And here you get this sense of these wonderful clouds, this relaxing, beautiful day, the sun-dappled foreground, this really kind of virtuoso quick brush stroke in the foreground of all the foliage, the effects of water and movement, and just this gorgeous plein air painting, which was purchased almost immediately by an American collector in 1875, a man named Alexander Turney Stewart. He brought it back to the United States. It was included in the 1893 Columbia World Exposition in Chicago, which was a major, major event. It was in a pavilion of, you'll love the title, Foreign Art Owned by American Collectors. But it hung us alongside the works of Manet, Degas, and Monet. Unfortunately, it was Fortuny's last painting. He died that fall, November of 1874. But what a wonderful legacy he left, and really just this notion of leisure activity, going to the beach. People did not go to the beach prior to the last quarter of the 19th century. The beach was where fishermen went, dock workers went, but the idea of people, especially in this case women, just relaxing seaside was something relatively new. I love those dresses. I cannot imagine getting the sand out of all of those wonderful frocks, but it sure looks beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about William Hood Stewart, who some of you know was an incredible correspondent. We'll talk about him. He was an American from Philadelphia who had made his fortune in sugarcane in Cuba. As a result, he spoke perfectly fluent Spanish. He moved his family from Philadelphia to Paris in 1865, so right after the Civil War, and he lived there until his death in 1897. He went with his huge family, his wife, Ellen Price Morgan, and their 7 surviving children. Here's a wonderful photograph of him. Really significant, because how would anyone of means traditionally have their portrait done? Not a photograph. You'd commission an artist. You'd commission a leading artist of the day to paint your portrait, and there was a lot of prestige in who did it. So here Stewart is doing this, showing this radical new medium of photography and having himself memorialized in this way. An art historian at the end of the 19th century, John Charles Van Dyke, wrote an essay in the Paris Art Review called Two Private Collections in Paris. And he wrote that Stewart's collection represents almost exclusively the brilliancy of technical accomplishment, and it is so brilliant as to be almost dazzling. Now, what Stewart did, in addition to collecting art, is he kept this wonderful portfolio, and it's not what we think of a portfolio. It's more like a gigantic photo album, which contains 370 photographs as well as 193 letters, sketches, and ephemera collected with his correspondence between artists and collectors and dealers and royalty and aristocracy from around Europe. It is a fantastic document that the Meadows acquired a couple of years ago.
2012 or 13?
So about 5 years ago. And I hope you were all lucky enough to see its contents spread out. But there were letters from Fortuny, and there were letters from Tunis and Rico, and there were sketches that they did at the bottom of their letters. This is what we saw today. There were wonderful little anecdotes from artists who were working together but sending it in one envelope, right, because it was expensive to send airmail, saying, I forget who it was, I think it was one of the Madrazos who said, and I might be getting the names wrong, but basically like Rico won't let me write more because he says paper is too expensive. So I mean, these wonderful slice of life things that are terrific monuments and terrific documents for us to have. This is one of them that that is in the Stewart portfolio by Riccardo de Madrazo. The Madrazo family was gigantic, or quite large, and this is Portrait of Raimundo Madrazo by his brother, done in 1871, and it's a tiny little postcard. Stewart was the largest collector of the work of Eduardo Zamacois. He owned 4 of his pieces. Of Martin Ricos, he owned 11 Ricos, and the largest collector of Mariano Fortuny's, and he owned 25 works by Fortuny. He was also a champion for these artists. He encouraged other American collectors to buy their work, and I think there were probably multiple reasons for this. First of all, he could communicate with them, and not everybody was speaking Spanish. Certainly not Americans, certainly not Frenchmen, certainly not the way people can communicate nowadays. But so he was this wonderful translator. He was able to promote the work, and he supported these artists. I mean, there were times when Martin Rico was so down on his luck, and had it not been for Mr. Stewart, who knows what would have happened to him. It was also, selfishly, a lot cheaper to acquire a Martin Rico than it was to acquire, say, a Velázquez, or, you know, numerous old masters. And so it was a great way to build a collection, and I think that's a wonderful watchword. Buying contemporary art by young artists is a good way to build a collection. True now as it was then. He would buy a lot of work straight from the studio, and so he made studio visits, and he was one of these very enlightened collectors in a way that Raymond Nasher was as well, that artists really felt he knew what he was talking about, they could discuss their work with him. And when you talk to sculptors, contemporary sculptors here in Dallas, and they talk about Mr. Nasher, they always say that when you would go to his house and you'd see all the work in the house, it was like talking to another sculptor. I mean, he knew it, he loved it, and he wasn't just buying it as something to have, but he was buying it out of a sheer sense of love, and Stewart was the same way. This painting on the left, The Choice of a Model, was by Fortuny. Stewart bought it out of his studio. We are now fortunate enough to have it upstairs. If you've not already seen it, please be sure to do so. Once again, Mark Roglan, the director at the Meadows, was able to secure a loan. It's actually in the collection of the National Gallery of Art. And no, initially I did not have it. I pulled it out of my lecture notes, but then when I saw it upstairs, when I found out it was upstairs, I thought, oh, we've got to bring this back. So go see it. This image is somewhat fuzzy. I know there are those of you in this gathering who still think it's fuzzy, even when you see it in person. So some people love it, some people hate it. It's one of the things you'll see tonight is the 1860s seemed to be the decade of the naked ladies. And so here you've got this choice of the model, this woman standing on a table in the Palazzo Colonna in Rome. The table is in the Palazzo Colonna. You can go there and see it. The naked lady, I believe, no longer is part of the museum, though. So. But you've got this sense of these 6 artists standing here all frilled up, and just looking what they're wearing to paint is unbelievable. And here's this woman who's just shed her clothes, and she's standing posing for them. Typically, around this time, when you had young women, you had different kinds of young women posing for artists. Women like that who just shed their clothes. As you can see, they're strewn about. If you can't really make it out, that blue, it's her frock. There's also a red or pinkish thing on top of that. You can go upstairs and see it. That, you know, at this time you start having models like that, as well as models who come with their chaperone. You know, they're trying to show that it's getting to be more respectable model for art. I don't know that that was necessarily the case for this young woman. There are other paintings in the background that are actual paintings that were in the Palazzo Colonna. And so, you know, this wonderful painting of art about art, which you see a lot of in the 19th century. This work, as I said, was purchased from the studio after Stuart's death, there was a gigantic auction of his work in New York in 1898. William Clark, who was a copper magnate, purchased this. In 1926, he bequeathed it and 800 other objects from his collection to the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which at the time was a new institution. It had opened in 1890. It recently closed, and the contents of it went to the National Gallery. Most of the contents went to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, down the street. So that's where this painting is now. And the same art historian, Charles Van Dyke, calls Fortuny the watchword of Stuart's artistic household, the keystone of his handsome collection. He also credits Stuart with collecting work of, and I quote, the greatest of the technicians, Zamacois, Boldini, Madrazo, Messonnier, Voland, Jérôme, de Nittis, Alma Tadama, Pettenkoff, and Leibel are also in his gallery, and occasionally, like pearls amid diamonds, glows the exquisite luster of a Corot, a Daubigny, or a Troyon, but Fortuny is preeminent. And I just love the way people wrote, like diamonds and jewels. So this painting by Messonnier was in the collection, The End of a Game of Cards. It's from 1865. Small work. I mean, this is not doing it justice. It's like 8 by 7. It is tiny. You would probably easily pass it by in the Walters Art Museum where it currently lives. But I brought in Messonnier last time. You may remember his corpse-strewn road that he had come upon as a National Guard's captain. But this was the type of work that Messonnier was famous for at the time, these small little genre scenes that look almost as if they could be 17th century. So if a lot of those artists are people that from that list, people you're not familiar with, it gives you an idea that some people somehow survive, some people don't, as far as the test of time. But a lovely little painting by Messonnier. And again, Stuart was a big collector of these Barbizon painters. This one on the left is by Camille Corot. This is not the one that was in Stuart's collection. I couldn't find an image of it, but this is really close to the one that he bought. This is of Ville d'Avray from 1867. There is a livret, a little booklet, a catalog that you can access online with all the paintings that were sold from that auction. The one that was auctioned shows a farmer with his hand on a willow tree on the left, with a stream running behind it and a white house on a hill behind it. So this is a similar place. This is sort of if you had moved over a bit one way or the other. His hand was on the left. Nope, the left. So if you moved a bit to the right, it would have been this spot. It was one of Corot's favorite spots to paint. And this was another work that the actual Corot, was another work that Stuart bought straight out of Corot's studio. So again, he was making the rounds of studios, visits, which meant he had to know the artist. You don't just walk into a studio, right? You need to know someone. Here's the Daubigny Auvers-sur-Oise from 1864, which, as I was saying to Suzanne before, this painting I believe is available. If you look where it is, it's a Thomas Colville Fine Art. So if you're looking to enhance your collection with multiple historic references, this painting did belong to William Stuart at one point. And among the correspondence, to give you an idea of the kind of correspondence Stuart had, there was one exchange he had with Martin Rico from around 1873. And Rico writes to Stuart regarding the work that he had done in Paris. And Rico says, "You are quite correct about the small panels, which take so much time to paint but do not produce the same effect as a slightly larger painting. But I made them because I didn't know what to do in Rome, and I wanted to try small paintings, which are fun because you don't have to carry so many things, a chair, an easel, a paint box, and a painting." So that's not exactly a business letter. That is absolutely a correspondence one would have with one's friend. For 25 years, Stuart also hosted a weekly Sunday lunch in which the entire art community of Paris would descend. And Corot came, and Daubigny came, and Jérôme came, and Messonnier. Theodore Rousseau was there, Constant Troyon was there, the Baroness de Rothschild came, as well as American artists such as William Merritt Chase and Mary Cassatt. So they had a way, a venue in which to actually know each other. I mean, they certainly probably would have known each other's work, but they had an actual way to come together every single week. Finally, in our Naked Lady tour of the 1860s, we've got this incredible painting by Paul Baudry, who also decorated the Paris Opera. To give you an idea, last time we looked at Manet's Olympia and what a scandal it was, this was painted before Olympia. And somehow this didn't create the same kind of a scandal. And I don't know if it's because it was painted from the back and not the front, but it's quite voluptuous, I would say. You've got this painting, it's not small, I mean, it's 33 by 70 inches. She's quite larger than life. Sprawled out across the entire diagonal of the picture plane, looking back at us with this, make whatever you want of that look, but sort of this come hither look. This was shown at the Paris Salon of 1863. So unlike the Salon de Refusé of 1863, this one actually made it in, believe it or not. It did cause quite a stir, however. Now, there were, as I mentioned, were Americans in Paris. A lot of them came, there were a confluence of events. Of course, the Civil War ended in 1864, and so that prompted a lot of people afterwards to start coming to Europe. There were artists coming to Europe prior to the Civil War. James McNeill Whistler was in Paris between 1855 and 59, so even though he'd come back to the US, his work was still in the Salon de Refusé in 1863. There was a group of artists about whom we don't really talk that much anymore, but their work was fascinating, and they include Abbot Thayer, Thomas Dewing, Augustus St. Gaudens, and George de Forest Brush, who all met in Paris in the 1870s. John Singer Sargent was in Paris, and Theodore Robinson actually ended up going to Giverny and working with Monet later in the century. The two that we will talk about tonight are Mary Cassatt, who was there again in this early period, 1851 to 1855. She came back to the US, and then in 1866, she returned to France, and she stayed there until her death in 1926. William Merritt Chase just traveled around a lot, but we know for sure he was in Paris in 1881. And we'll talk, well, we also know that he had spent a lot of his time in Germany, and I'll talk about that when we get to him, as well as Spain. But Mary Cassatt was a very, again, wonderful artist, wonderful female artist, who starts painting. I mean, she's painting the whole time, and we'll look at some of her later work, because by the 1870s, she starts to be influenced a lot by the work of Courbet and Monet, as well as by Japanese woodblock prints. And you see this in this wonderful image on the left, 5 o'clock tea from 1879. I love this one woman with her pinky up. I mean, how affected can you get? But you see this very layered perspective, very much like the Japanese woodblock prints. But what else is kind of weird about this image? What kind of conversation are they having? None. So you've got the hostess on the left, kind of looking like, how many more cups of tea do I have to give her before I can ask her to leave? And the lady drinking tea, like, what have they acquired now? So, I mean, there's this complete disconnect between these figures, and this is actually very characteristic of late 19th century American painting. So these artists, Thomas Dewing, Abbot Thayer, they do a lot of these images of these women living in these gilded cages, just staring off into the distance and really not interacting with one another at all. There is a barrier even to us, the viewer. You've got the silver tea service, coffee and tea service, that's really just keeping us out of the scene as well. And as you can see, there are 2 teacups on it, and so we are not invited. But this very the quick brush strokes, you can get a sense of this porcelain on the hearth there that's probably Asian, Japanese, or Chinese as these things start moving into Europe. So you get the sense of a very wealthy household. And then this image on the right, this beautiful image of a woman with a pearl necklace in a loge. So people at the theater. But again, what's kind of weird and different and modern and unique about this image? The brushwork, so very quick brushwork. Where is she? Yeah, she's in a booth in the opera, but look, there's like a mirror. So you see her back, and then you see, it's like from Phantom of the Opera, people watching us, watching them. And so you've got sort of these voyeurs in the back looking at this, as far as we know, single woman out at night at the theater. Very unusual. Happy to be, as far as we know, happy to be single and alone at the theater, wearing this somewhat revealing dress. And again, this sense of who's being looked at, who's the voyeur, and who is being looked upon. So she's looking at somebody, you're not sure if she's looking at the people looking at her, if they're all looking at the stage. There's this very strange perspective about the work that, again, now from where we sit in the 21st century, we might just say, oh yeah, a woman at the opera, but this was a very dynamic, different sort of way of making a painting. Over here on the right, from 1877, woman and child driving. And again, the carriageman is more like a footman. So you look at this and say, well, why is the woman doing the driving, and how did that come to pass? But this modern woman with this young girl in the Bois de Boulogne, which had been created as part of Napoleon III's beautification of Paris. It's from 1881. The woman driving is her sister, Lydia Cassatt, and the child is one of Degas' nieces. So at this time, she and Edgar Degas become good friends. They're painting each other's family, and as you can see, moving about the city. Beginning in 1877, Mary Cassatt is invited to participate in the Impressionist exhibition. So the first Impressionist exhibition is held in 1874. That's a really important art date. And they continue. There are 8 of them all told, and they continue until 1886. By 1879, her work is coming back stateside. It's being shown in New York. The following decade, she's painting her very iconic mother and child themes, just as Renoir will be painting. And this boating party that you see here on the left is from 1893 to 94. At this time, she's starting to spend all of her summers in Antibes, which is on the French Riviera. But you see the flattening effects of Japanese woodblock painting. This particular image was the focal point of an exhibition, of her first solo exhibition in the United States in 1895. But even the perspective is somewhat tilted. The sunlight is a bit uneven, but it's a very unique, it's a very almost unsettled kind of an image. Any questions so far? I know I'm kind of zipping through her, but I want to talk about William Merritt Chase, because he's important to us for so many reasons. Okay. Now, William Merritt Chase is part of this group of American artists who study in Munich in the late 19th century. They're at the Royal Academy. He lives there between 1872 and 1878, so right at this critical time, even though he's not in Paris, he's in Munich, and so people knew what was going on, obviously, around Europe. And he comes under the influence of 17th century painting. And by the time he gets to Munich, he's from Indiana originally. He had already been to New York City to study, and he makes the leap across the Atlantic. And this is one of these early paintings from this time. Keying up, the court jester. Has anyone heard that expression, keying up? Well, apparently it was a 19th century expression for drinking up, for kind of getting yourself drunk is a way to loosen yourself up. And so here you see this jester keying up. He's getting himself ready to go out to perform with the bottle, this endless bottle. The inclusion of red, it was meant to give the viewer a sense of his inebriation. He's got this red nose. He's already keyed up apparently a little too much. This one is now at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, but it was shown at the Boston Club in Philadelphia, where it gained a lot of notoriety during the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, and it made him a young artist to watch at the time. And his early work, we'll see this again and again in a few more slides, this very dark, heavy, somber, anti-Barbizon painting. In the Barbizon schools, we're getting lighter and lighter, and here you've got what's going on in Germany that's just dark and morose. But he did make his way to Venice in 1877, and the reason why I'm doing it like this and not showing you all the Munich paintings first is because I needed to show the next two slides together. So we're sort of jumping to his trip to Venice in 1877. This is a courtyard in Venice. He probably met Martin Rico, who was also painting in Venice around this time. And you can see that there's light, that he sees another way, and this beautiful sense of an early morning, a woman in her courtyard, a very wonderful sense of calm that will pervade a lot of his later work. Before he leaves Munich, however, he's assigned this sketch for a picture. And the picture is Columbus before the Council of Salamanca. This is from 1876. The one on the left is the one he does first. So where are we, the viewer, in this one? Behind him. Now, students at the Munich School were encouraged to do themes from the Bible, themes from history, themes from literature, always placing the central figure right in the middle and always having that central figure orating out to you, the viewer. It was meant to be like theater. So you felt as though Columbus was orating or giving you this argument as to why he should go to the New World. But if he did that, then how do you know who he's giving this talk to? How do you know how he's making his argument to? Because you've got this council, we see them in front of us, but if you turned it around, that wouldn't make any sense. Well, it won first prize that year in their competition, which was great, except that his painting teacher was livid, because how dare you, not only have his back to you, but you defied all of our teachings. Do it again. So Chase said, okay, I'll do it again. But, he still couldn't, it still didn't make any sense to him to have Columbus orating to us, because, where's the council that he's making this argument to? And to put them behind him would have just been ridiculous. And so he does this side view, which was a compromise. And instead of ever turning this into a painting, he says, you know what, I'm going to go home. And he packs up and he comes back to the United States. Now, he comes back to the U.S. in 1878, and where he helps to found the Society of American Artists. And in 1884, he does the same with the Society of Painters in Pastel. To make a living, he was painting portraits here, but he kept coming back to Europe. He was in France, where he was taken with the work of Manet in 1881. In 1881 and 1882, he goes to Spain, where he's looking particularly at the work of Velázquez, and he befriends another important Spanish artist. Exactly, Joaquin Sorolla. I can't say it half as beautifully as you do, but Sorolla, who is also an emerging artist, and who of course is going to become one of the most important artists in Spain in the 19th century. And I hope that all of you had a chance to see the magnificent exhibition we had of Sorolla's work here a couple of years ago. But they become friends, and you start seeing again the influence of one on the other. If you look at these two paintings, this is your art history quiz for the night. What Velázquez do you think they were looking at that inspired this work? Thank you. Las Meninas, which I should have brought in, but the gigantic Velázquez painting of the king coming in, and you only know it's the king coming in because you see his reflection, the king and queen on the mirror in the back, and you see, the Infanta and the court arrayed in front of him. And so here you've got these two artists, Hallett Shinnecock on the left, and by Chase, and My Family on the right by Sorolla. And they were very similar in many ways. First of all, they were married men, and apparently Sorolla in particular was adamant that he was married to his wife, and that was it. He didn't fool around, he was faithful to her, and he had no patience for men who were not faithful to their wives. But his wife, Clotilde, was also very much an important part of his practice. And the same was true for William Merritt Chase. His wife, Alice, was very much a part of what he was doing as well. And so here they've included their families. You can see in the Chase image, you can see his reflection in the mirror on the armoire in the very back. Sorry, my pointer isn't working. And what are his children looking at? But a series of Japanese woodblock prints in the front, modern. And the same with the Sorolla on the right, that you've got his reflection in the mirror behind. And I love his reflection. Even the way he's put it on this mirror, it almost gives you a sense of Velázquez in Las Meninas, where you see this gigantic canvas and you see him poking his head out from behind it. You get that same sense here. But both of them used light beautifully. I love the light on this young daughter here, this gorgeous white dress that just pops out at you. This one is from 1901. The Hallett Shinnecock is from 1892. So even though they're painting sort of similarly, there is a 10-year difference between a lot of the paintings, as you'll see. And as you can see, his painting, whoops, oh boy. Okay, I'm just going the wrong way here. To it this way. His paintings did, lighten up. So I will talk to you about that other painting that I hope you saw fleetingly. But that was his daughter. That was William Merritt Chase's daughter. And he titled it The Infanta. And if Scott gets back, I will have him go back to that image for us. But he has her dressed up like a Spanish infanta, and he named her, if you can believe this, the subtitle is My Little Daughter, Helen Velázquez Chase, posing as an infanta. So, I mean, the poor kid. Can you imagine giving your child Velázquez, your daughter Velázquez as a middle name? Anyhow, it was from 1899. It's in a private collection. You can Google it if I can't get it up, but it's just this straight portrait, not too dissimilar from a lot of the Velázquez portraits of infantas we have upstairs, in this tight-fitting dress with the gigantic skirt. And she takes up the entire picture plane. So the two of them did numerous portraits. It was a way to make a living, but they also were painting en plein air. And I wish I could get rid of this. Oh gosh. Let's see if I can. Okay, I am making a mess of this. But I can't go back using this. Okay. Okay, we will just do our best, and I won't touch anything I don't need to touch. Chase, and I'm sorry because there's a beautiful Sorolla in back, the slide, the one we just passed over, but William Merritt Chase, along with Archer M. Huntington, was really instrumental in introducing Sorolla's work to American audiences at the end of the 19th century. And when Huntington brought Sorolla to New York in 1909, it was Chase and his wife Alice who had he and Clotilda over to dinner at their home. As I said, both men used their wives as models, but they did this to show respectability, that it was respectable for women to be a model. As you will note, there are no naked ladies in these images from the 1870s and 1880s. Their wives are fully clothed. There is no mayonnaise model. It's their wives who they're showing as respectable women. And they showed them, they were both working en plein air, outdoors. The image that I tried to pull up was the end of the season. You see this beautiful pastel of this woman at the beach. All the chairs, the deck chairs, are folded inwards. And then this gorgeous snapshot Biara, it's from 1906 by Sorolla, of his wife at the beach with his wonderful veil, and just sitting and seeing the effects of light and how it changed. With both of their work, you have this, they follow the Impressionist precept, and really Barbizon precept, of putting in all these red dots so that you could kind of follow the red dots all the way through. Let me see if I can at least get rid of this. Shoot. Ah, oh, God, sorry. Okay, we're going to leave this. Even though Chase was starting to use a lot of the same elements that the Impressionists did, his technique remained American, using this very bravura brushstroke, and his subject matter, according to Barbara Rose, was painted in the smiling aspects of American life. So there's a great deal of optimism. And the only good thing I can say about passing over the image of Idle Hour is that you will see it. It is one of the exhibition images, and I will come back to it, and barring any more catastrophes, you'll be able to see it towards the end. Now, Chase and Sorolla were influential teachers. Chase taught in New York City, he taught in Philadelphia, he taught in Chicago, and during the summers between 1891 and 1902, he taught on Long Island at his school, the Shinnecock Hills Summer School of Art. He encouraged his students to look at the work of Sorolla. In 1896, he opened his own art school in New York called the Chase School of Art. It later was renamed the New York School of Art, and it still continues today as the Parsons School of Design. So that is the origin of Parsons. Chase was one of the worked on, he was on the committee for the exhibition, the World Columbian Exposition in 1893. So chances are very good that he knew the Fortuny painting at Beach of Portici. And so you see this effect of the two, of one work on the other in this. And again, we'll see both of them momentarily. What's interesting as well is that U.S. art schools, unlike the schools in Paris, were co-ed, and in the last quarter of the century, from 1870 to 1890, the number of female students in art schools rose from almost a tenth of the class in 1870 to almost 50% of it in 1890. So it grew that quickly, and a lot of them were working with photography, a lot of them were working in a variety of new media. By the 1880s, the work of the Barbizon artists, so this first group of artists we looked at 2 weeks ago, was making its way to the United States. The work of the French Impressionists was starting to make its way to the United States. And so American artists who did not make it to Paris were able to see this new experimental and avant-garde work. And certainly their work was shown at the World Columbian Exposition in 1893 in Chicago. And that's significant because it meant people from the middle of the country could see the work of the Impressionists. So you didn't just have to be in New York City at the time. Now, according to Susan Faxon in the catalog Coming of Age, which was an exhibition here at the Meadows several years ago, the French Impressionists were relishing in the, as she says, the fluidity of paint, the brilliance of color, and the effects of light on their adventurous works. Now, you'll recall that last time I mentioned that paint was able, they were finally getting oil paint in tubes. So when you think of it, oil paint, this kind of oil paint, was new media. It was a new medium that allowed you to have a degree of control. You didn't have to make your own pigments. You didn't have to worry that you're in the country and, oh my goodness, they can't find this root, or you can't grind this. You had this uniformity that you could count on over and over again, and therefore an ability to use the same colors in different ways. And you knew time and time again how it would turn out. So tonight we're going to look specifically at the work of Monet and Pissarro because they're direct artistic descendants of Daubigny and Corot, respectively. We're also going to look at the work of Alfred Cicely. So I'm so sorry, the Renoir fans among you. I'm not talking about him specifically. He was a student of Diaz de la Peña, but the reason why I'm leaving him out is because these other artists were far better known for their landscapes than Renoir, who painted more urban scenes than landscape scenes. So he's a beautiful artist. I love Renoir's work, but tough choices had to be made. And so unfortunately, Renoir got the axe. The other significant aspect to these artists working together is that they were working together. They were no longer in the studio of another master studying under him. They were a group of artists going out into the country together and painting together, which was a radically different break from the past. So Claude Monet took the title of the greatest landscape artist from Corot, who had been the greatest landscape artist up until that time. He grew up in Le Havre in Normandy and went to Paris when he was in his 20s, so in the 1860s. And before he was the greatest landscape artist, he was just another young artist wandering around the halls of the Louvre. He saw all of these easels set up and all of these young artists painting copies of what other artists had already painted. But he was far more interested in looking out the window and seeing how the city below him was changing. He entered the Parisian studio of Charles Gleyre in 1862, and it was here that he met up with his fellow students, and he became friends with them, including Renoir, Frédéric Bazille, who unfortunately died in the Franco-Prussian War, so his story ends in 1870, and Alfred Cicely, and they remain lifelong friends, and they go into the country together to paint. Now, to give you an idea of what they were doing in Gleyre's studio, here's Gleyre's painting, 1867, Sappho. I mean, really? Like, I mean, so another naked lady, and you know, he's taking her from Greek mythology, so it's okay. Greek mythology in, oh, by the way, in 19th century French boudoir. But it is beautiful. It is magnificently painted, gorgeously executed, very academic, very typical of what was going on in France at the time. And you know, there are a lot of people who will look at this derisively like, so bourgeois, but the Impressionists were doing something different. Whatever you feel about it, it is a beautiful painting. It is magnificently rendered. And here you've got Monet sort of going along and painting a figure in a similar way, sort of this woman, this time clothed, looking back over her shoulder, again, sort of taking up most of the picture plane, woman in a green dress from 1866, and in fact it's Camille Dancieux, whom he will marry a few short years later. Now, he's also intrigued and enjoying going into the country to paint. And Monet is one of the artists who's painting with Daubigny. Here's this Daubigny on the left, Morning from 1863. This painting is in Indiana, at the Eskenazi Museum at Indiana University, and Monet's painting of The Walk a few years later, 1865 to 67. So master and student, and Daubigny, as we know, was not exactly a teacher. He did not say, come, I will teach you how to paint, but you can join me while I paint outdoors. So what do you think of the two side by side? They're very similar. You get a sense of, you know, they were looking compositionally at similar things, this idea of a road in this case. I mean, you know that Daubigny created a studio boat. We'll see Monet's studio boat in a little while. Daubigny painted a road leading into the woods. Monet painted a road leading into the woods, but the effect of light is so much different in the Monet. And one of the things that Rick Britell says about this Monet is that he paints in a much more rapid style, and Britell describes it as having an urgency and restlessness, and he writes, there's a kind of visual drama and electricity in the sky which is utterly absent in the subtler and more refined painting of Daubigny. And he further emphasizes that Monet and others working in this style were students. This was a rebellious form of painting. You know, it was just so different, the light, the shadows, this dynamism that you get that, you know, you don't have in the Daubigny, which is not to put down Daubigny, he was a beautiful painter, but there is an urgency here that is quite new. And so you've got these young artists starting their own rebellion in landscape painting, which seems almost like an oxymoron, but they made it happen. They accomplished it. This one we saw last time, the Scène at Bougival from 1869. Martin Rico was painting in the same area a year later. I did not bring this back because there's a dearth of Monet images, because as you know, there certainly is not. But rather because Marilyn Hoffman, who's the director of the Currier Museum of Art in Manchester, New Hampshire, which is where this painting resides, says that this painting is not only the beginning of Impressionism, but represents the end of a tradition for French landscape painting. So you get a sense that it's new, it's different. The way the picture plane is broken up. When you see this painting in person, you can see these very rapid brush strokes, the effects of light that are really kind of scintillating and making the air kind of move as well. The way that the light comes in, and you've got the shadows, and the shadows of the trees are equal with the shadows of the people. So what we saw last time with Millet creating this sense of equality between the people, the figures, and the landscape, Monet continues with as well. And the 1870s were the glory days. You know, the next decade are really the glory days of a lot of these artists. He marries Camille in 1870. They honeymoon in Trouville. This painting may, had we been able to see those two, have looked familiar, of a woman on the beach in her frock with this wonderful veiled hat, her parasol. But just remember, this was done in 1870. This was done 20 years before William Merritt Chase's painting, and you know, add another 10 years to what Sorolla was doing. So this was really early to be doing this kind of woman of leisure at the beach. And this sense of the waves that are just these quick brush strokes that are so different. Now, even though all of these artists lived in poverty, they were painting, and they were doing something that was very revolutionary. Their work was not well loved, to put it mildly, by the salon, and they kept getting rejected over and over again by the salon. And so finally, in December of 1873, Monet and all of his friends, so these artists I've mentioned, Renoir, Pissarro, Sicily, Paul Cézanne, Berthe Morisot, Degas, form a collective known as the Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. So, I mean, you can tell this is a group of young artists, right? I mean, the Anonymous Association. Who says this? And they decide to get together to mount their own exhibitions, their own independent exhibitions, to be able to show what they want, to be able to invite other progressive artists to show them with them. And they have their first group exhibition, again, in the spring of 1874. There are 30 artists showing 165 works. The exhibition is up for about a month. Over 3,500 people come to see it. So there's a thirst in Paris for contemporary art. And one of the paintings in it is this now iconic painting, Impressionism, Sunrise, from 1872, done by Claude Monet. Now, there's no right or wrong answer here. How many of you love this painting? All right. How many of you are kind of like, meh? Okay. Well, the same thing happened in 1874. The critics, however, were howling. They hated this. And one in particular, a man named Louis Leroy, it's spelled Leroy in English, had this to say about it. Well, first of all, he dubbed it derisively as Impressionism, like to turn it into contemporary vernacular, like what the heck? Impressionism, like what's he doing here? And he says scathingly, wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than this seascape. Now, at this point, Monet is not the greatest landscape painter. He's just another young artist, and that is devastating. I mean, it would be devastating, but he probably relished in this kind of commentary, because what's this going to do if you're reading it? and you're young, you're going to hot tail it to this exhibition to say, I want to see what is worse than wallpaper in its embryonic state. But you've got this sense, this impression of the sunrise. And to Monet, that was new, that he didn't have to paint an actual sunrise. He can just create the impression of a sunrise. It was a new way of seeing, and he said at the time, it was as if a veil was torn from my eyes, and I understood what painting could be. Completely radical. And even though Monsieur Leroy called them Impressionists and Impressionism as a put-down, he and Renoir said, we're Impressionists. And they completely embraced this new term for a new form of art, for a new way of seeing. And in 1874, he builds his own studio boat, just as Daubigny had, and he starts going out on the water. So here's a painting by Monet in his studio boat from 1874. And here you've got a painting that Monet did from his studio boat of the view of Vautour in the summer from 1880. But here, you know, you've got Impressionism really in this wonderful, very magnificent form, the effect of light, the shimmering reflection of the banks on the water, and just a new way of seeing and a new way of expressing oneself. Now, times were still difficult. I mean, the public had not caught on to this yet. And so in order to make a living, he was still doing these little still lifes of apples and grapes because he could sell them. This one's from 1880. It's in the Art Institute of Chicago. But even with these, he's playing with the effects of light. I mean, look at that white tablecloth. Have you ever seen a tablecloth just radiate and just shimmer like that? And even the effect of the light on the grapes, it's sort of as if he took all those lessons of Dutch 17th century painting and made it new, got it ready for the next century. He was also painting these images. He was taken, as with everybody else, with this notion of Japonesism, this notion of bringing Japanese life and culture because it was new and it was exotic. And so here you've got Madame Monet in a Japanese kimono from 1875. This is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. But I mean, the kimono is fantastic, and look at the figure on it. And she almost becomes one with the fans. I mean, there's this flat plane and this tilted perspective, the tilted horizon line, that spectacular vermilion. I mean, imagine having to make that pigment, but to be able to just squeeze it out of a tube and know you can just have that stunning red. And you've got, I love sort of the play on this with the fans in the background, and she's holding a fan, and you've got the faces on the fan, and then you've got her little face popping up. So again, this was very experimental. It was a new way of looking. Now, unfortunately, the decade came to a crashing end for Monet because his beloved Camille died in 1879, and that winter was one of the worst winters on record in France. The winter of 1880 was considered a mini ice age. Now, for a landscape painter, it might not be such a bad thing. And he goes outside and he starts painting, and I'm sure, you know, he was so bereft with the passing of his wife that this was almost a cathartic thing to just sit out in the cold and paint. And remember, you know, it's very lovely to paint on the river in the summer in France, but it's a whole nother thing to be out there in the winter. And so here you've got this Levacourt in winter, 1879, and you get a sense of the cold. You almost shiver looking at this work. You get a sense, even with these quick brush strokes, of the slushy road with this just faint lines. You get a sense of these trees and the limbs, that, you know, these bare limbs on the left here. You know where he's painting. Obviously, he's not in a boat at this point, but he's on land, and that he set up his easel outside. And I couldn't get these two slides together neatly, so I just brought them in separately. But Breakup of the Ice at Levacourt from 1880. His friends, I mean, this was a real breakthrough for him, and his friends decided to put together a one-man show for him, a one-man retrospective, and they organized put it together, And it was a huge success. And what Monet said of the work at the time is he said, I was trying to do the impossible, to paint light itself. So unlike a lot of his paintings where he eventually started just changing out his canvas every hour to record the effects of light, here he was just painting quietly in this winter of such horrible grief and such personal trauma, and he was able to come up with this. Now, in the 1890s, he moves to Giverny, where he paints some of his most iconic work, his haystacks, his poplars, his water lilies. And, you know, because I want to cover a few other artists, I'm going to wrap up Monet here, but you all know he's got this incredible 58-year career, and this series really lands him with his feet on the ground, and he really never goes hungry again. I mean, he's a huge financial success from here on in, from 1880 on. Any questions or comments? Monet? Okay. Now, Alfred Sisley is one that has really kind of fallen out of the realm of well-known. For whatever reason, he was a beautiful painter. He was, of all of them, the one who painted landscapes almost exclusively. His father had been a wealthy silk merchant. His father was British, and Sisley was a British subject. But he was born in France. He was French for all intents and purposes. And he had had a very easy life. You know, his father supported him. His father wanted him to go back to London and study finance, and he said, yeah, maybe not. I think I'll just go back to the country and paint with my pals. And somehow his father managed to support him. But with the Franco-Prussian War, his father was devastated financially. And so suddenly, Sisley had to try to find a way to sell his paintings, which unfortunately he did not do too well. So he lived in poverty throughout his life. Was a beautiful artist, very similar to Monet, and of course the reason being because they were painting together. So I think it's always important to make that distinction that he was not copying Monet, they were just painting side by side and influencing each other. But you've got this beautiful work, Saint-Martin Canal from 1872, it's in Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Again, very similar to the work of Monet. He painted over 900 canvases. So all I can tell you is if you might not have the $40 million budget to buy a Monet, you might be able to find the work of Sisley at a much more reasonable price at auction. So again, if that's where your interests lie, keep an eye out for him. But you get a sense that he was not on the water, but on this bank right here on the right, looking at this canal, this wonderful effect of summer. And you also get a sense with this painting of just this quiet time in a French village. This probably early afternoon, people have just had lunch, and this sense of serenity, which again, after sort of the tumult of everything going on in Paris, was really a pleasure. This one that he also painted as a result of that mini ice age in 1880 after the debacle, the Sienne at Pont de Suresnes from 1880 again. And it was a debacle. I mean, if you're living in an agrarian society and suddenly everything floods, it's devastating. It wipes out your crops. If your roads are wiped out, you have no way to get your crops to market. And so you get a real sense, even though this is not sort of the displacement that was going on in Paris, this was a real crisis for people in the country in 1880. And again, this leaden sky, which really reflects the leaden mood, I'm sure, of the people trying to rebuild the roads and the barges. And this sense of flooding that, you've got the trees in the background, but this sense that where these men are standing was underwater probably a few days earlier, and just the marshiness of the whole place. And then this beautiful snow effect at Argenteuil from 1874. And again, I think it's just sad that history has sort of written Sisley out of it, because he was a stunning painter. I mean, the light here is just wonderful. Now, finally, we're going to look at the work of Camille Pissarro. Pizarro was born in St. Thomas in 1830. He grew up speaking Spanish, which was fantastic for Martin Rico because he got to France and couldn't speak a word of French, but he met Pizarro, and suddenly he had someone with whom he could communicate. Pizarro was sent to France for boarding school when he was 12 years old, around 1842. He ended up going back to St. Thomas for a while and then returns to France permanently in 1855. Now, to give you an idea of what Pizarro was feeling, the excitement he had for being in Paris in the middle of the 1850s, he did these two paintings. So Paris was an upheaval, it was a whole construction site, people were being displaced, people were being thrown out of their homes with no place to go, the chasm between rich and poor was growing, and all of this weighed very heavily on Pizarro. And again, history does repeat itself, and you know, if this sounds a little familiar, right here in Dallas, it's happened before. But Pizarro, you know, rather than think about the gloom and doom of what was happening in Paris in the time, he paints from memory his homeland. He does these two beautiful paintings, or they're among many that he did, of St. Thomas right after he arrives in France. So he's in this bustle, he's, you know, how there's dust everywhere, there are people everywhere, there's construction everywhere, and he says, you know what? I think I'd like to see this creek in St. Thomas once more. And that's what you've got on the right there, small. It's 9 by 13, just a tiny little painting. And as you will note, many of these are at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. So Pizarro lovers, that's your place. There is, I believe, a Cezanne exhibition up right now that's up until early July. So if your summer travel takes you to Washington, D.C. between now and then, you have that to look forward to. And two women chatting by the sea in St. Thomas, again from 1856. This depiction of this very calm, serene place with women who aren't rich, but they have what they need. There aren't 20 million people here. I don't know how many people were actually in Paris, but there were not just zillions of people. There were just these two women here and the people in the background, this sense of calm that you have. Now, Pizarro always considered himself a laborer, so he would not live in this rarefied world of being an artist. He considered himself a laborer who worked with his hands, and he had little regard for sort of the airs that people in Paris were putting on at the time. This was where he was in his mind. This is where he was in reality. This is a bit later. This is from the 1870s, male coach at Louveciennes from 1870. And you can see, again, he's taken on a lot of the same painterly qualities of Monet, of the other Impressionists. It's damp, it's cold, it's dark. It is not St. Thomas. So it's a whole, but it's a, you know, still very much in the country. Now, if you recall, Corot, who was his guidance when he was in France, always included peasants in his work, and sort of as an homage to Corot and to the life and the dignity of people, laborers, other manual laborers. You usually have working people, working the peasantry, going about their business in his work. The next time we start seeing his work is in 1872. Now, there's a big gap in the work of Pizarro, because in 1870, he and his family go to England. They're fleeing the Franco-Prussian War. Unbeknownst to him, his home in Louveciennes is occupied. And when he returns in 1872, he finds out that many of the paintings that he left behind were damaged or destroyed. So suddenly he's starting over. And this really exemplifies it. The chestnut trees at Louveciennes from 1872. You get this sense here of these two figures coming from a graveyard. The sense of, in many ways, that France probably was a graveyard. The sense that many of their friends and neighbors had probably been killed during the conflict. The sense that his work had been killed during the conflict. And there's a sense of despair, there's a sense of isolation and displacement, and this notion of displacement is one that he returns to subliminally over and over again. still rendered beautifully, but different from Monet. And in this one, you've got this gorgeous light effects, but it's still, you've still got these big blocks of paint. If you look at that church in the background, it's not been broken up. It's still solid blocks of paint. The image on the right is Orchard and Blossom. And this was created as in a sense of hopefulness. It was spring, it was rebirth, it was rebuilding, and an optimism that was happening in the country as well as in his work, that he could start over. You still have the peasants at work here. You've got this gorgeous sky, and then the branches of the trees and the buds on the trees that are broken up, again, very much the way a lot of these artists were painting. Now, this work was sold very shortly after he painted it, and it was sold fortuitously enough to someone from Paris named Paul Durand-Ruel. And if you know the work of the Impressionists, Durand-Ruel became the champion of this group of artists, and he was the one who was selling their work. He was the one promoting their work. So for Pissarro to end up in his collection was wonderful. It was the beginning of a great friendship, to quote Humphrey Bogart, a beautiful friendship, as it were. And he was the only one of the Impressionists to put work in every single one of the Impressionist exhibitions, in all 8 of the Impressionist exhibitions. He was very interested in light, these notions of photography that were being used by a lot of artists. A lot of artists were taking a lot of photographs, using them, trying to figure out how to manipulate light, the notion of perception, light perception, how your eyes view work, really fascinated Pissarro, and it was at this time that there was a lot of work being done in optics. He also had a chronic eye problem, which made him see things differently as well. So there were a confluence of events that made him start breaking up the picture plane. And he really pushed the needle forward with pointillism. And so suddenly these artists didn't really need to be en plein air anymore, right? Because if you're taking a photograph or you're seeing these peasants outside, but then you're coming back in the studio, I mean, you cannot do a pointillist painting en plein air. It would take you forever, right? And so you've got this is in the DMA collection, as I'm sure many of you know. You've got this breaking up, again, these quick dabs of paint that he knew, if you look at any of them closely, you know, they're just like these dots, but he knew standing back that they would create this wonderful cohesive whole. Yes, just little dabs of paint. But again, that's a really interesting way of you know, thinking about how your viewer is going to see the work. It's sort of on a micro level. You're no longer concerned, you know, as with Chase, of if the viewer's behind you or in front of you, or Manet, you're looking at Olympia, but you're looking sort of at this tiny microscopic level of how our eyes actually see the work itself. Now, this eye problem, unfortunately, kept him ultimately indoors. And these urban scenes were ones that Durand-Ruel was selling very well. Not just Pissarro's, but all the Impressionists, because if you think to these people who were putting on airs, many of whom had come in possibly from the country, you know, what are they going to want? Well, they want images of peasants. They left that behind. They want something modern. They want something urban. They want this new city that they're living in. They want a dynamism. And Pissarro really obliged them. This one was from a particular hotel room, and he did, you know, he would check into these hotel rooms in Paris as well as in Rouen, and he would just look out the window and sort of capture image A, image B, image C, image D. This was part of an exhibition the DMA put on many years ago called, I believe, Pissarro Impressions of the City, and they had actually, I mean, Rick Bertel, also, just God bless him, right, had this whole series of images from the same hotel room, one right after the other. It was pretty spectacular. And this was one of them. One of this boulevard was one of them. This is Boulevard des Italiens, morning sunlight. So he even recorded, as did Monet, the time of day. He made it scientific. There was nothing romantic about, morning bustle or rush hour. He called it what it was, morning sunlight. So you knew exactly where and when he was looking. This was from the Grand Hotel de Russie, and which gave him visual access to Boulevard Montmartre as well as Boulevard des Italiens. And in it, you get this sense of morning, really, on the lower right, the sense of sunlight coming in, the fact the other side is dark, this wonderful sense of sunlight over these trees in the foreground, because it's the city and you've got new buildings, and so therefore not all of them will be in sunlight, but this sense of movement and dynamism. And one of the things Sorolla talked about, and one of the reasons why Sorolla is so wonderful, is because he could paint water that was constantly moving. And the same thing is true with Pissarro. If you think back last week when we looked at that one photograph by Daguerre, that it was a 10-minute exposure, and so you had blurred people because they were moving around. Imagine trying to capture that, which is exactly what Pissarro was trying to do. And he wrote to his son Georges and said, "It's terribly difficult. It's almost like trying to catch a bird in flight. Carriages, buses, people among big trees, large buildings. It's tough. But what can I say? I must do it just the same." And so, the fact that you had all the people in Paris, number one, the fact they were moving, and here you almost can also get a sense of the blurriness in their movement on purpose. The fact that you had all this traffic, and imagine getting around. I mean, we think it's bad in cars in Paris, and any of you have ever been in a car or tried dodging them crossing the street know that it can be traumatic. But imagine these horses and these carriages and people getting on and off. But they had these wonderful grand boulevards, and again, these new buildings, and you could go out, you could be seen, you could wander around, day or night. And I think when you look at an image such as this, you really understand the allure of the country that a lot of these artists felt, that there was almost too much, it was almost visual overload to paint one of these. But here's Pissarro painting a modern city in a modern manner. So just to conclude, and here we've got idle hours that we got to see that. Idle hour on the left. This is the William Merritt chase that we had some clicker problems, so we ended up, no, that's okay. We're seeing it now. This beautiful idle hours done on Long Island. If you can imagine, those of you who are familiar with Long Island, it doesn't look like this anymore. But here Chase has also captured this notion of the red dots going across the image, but this wonderful, serene image of these respectable women in both of them, at leisure, enjoying their time by the sea. And though these artists, all of these artists, were so radical, it's important to remember that at some point they were also rooted in tradition. They were not just cutting off and starting anew, but they were part of a larger tradition. They were looking at nature anew, and in doing so, they were inventing a new way of seeing and looking at art. And they also gave us a new way to look at the landscape. And actually, I was at Connemara last week. I was at an MFA show for Arthur Garcia. Beautiful work. They're having a solstice celebration out there. But it reminded me of these paintings, of this restorative nature, restorative feeling of nature. Unlike previous times in which landscapes were seen with moral equations, at one point the landscape was wild. It was the wild life, and if you were in the wild, you were lost. And if it was a pristine French garden, it was civilized. There was no morality with these landscapes. It was just the notion of being out and being in a place of nurturing and revival in a world that was continuing to fracture. Finally, these artists really introduced us to this concept of leisure, an idea, at the beginning of the summer with which we should all reacquaint ourselves. So I hope you will all come see the exhibition. This is what you're going to see, and at the same time have a very peaceful and restorative summer. Thank you.